Well, with Labor governing at federal level and in every state and territory on the mainland, there's been a lot of talk lately about the future of the Liberal Party. Joining me to discuss the current political landscape is former Deputy Prime Minister John Anderson. John, welcome to the program. It's great to have you with me.
Good to be with you.
John, just before we get to the Liberal Party, what do you make of world leaders who either cannot or will not say what a woman is?
Well, it invites some world leaders to say that the West is in terminal decline because it doesn't know what it is, doesn't know what it believes in, it's sort of internally divided. I'd make two comments. The first is a really important philosophical one. We need to understand what's happening here. The greatest virtue today is that of autonomy. I am who I feel I am. That trumps everything else. And once you adopt that position, several things happen. One is you become, to some degree, anti-community and often family, because that's the smallest community. Secondly, you become anti-authority. You tend to believe in chaos and in individual rights being expressed over and above the common good. Thirdly, you tend to be very strongly against organised religion. How dare a God decide that I'm born male or female? I am autonomous. I will be whoever I like to be. The second great problem that is a real conundrum for progressive politics today, in my view, is that you hear this constant mantra, you must accept the science. We hear it all the time in relation to climate.
Right.
And fair enough, I think that's right. I believe in science. But what happens to biology when it clashes with the vibe that says, I will be who I feel I am? You can't have it both ways.
I think you make a great point. It certainly seems like we follow the science to the extent it agrees with our political narrative.
Well, and our view of our autonomy. So I will defy science. I will be who I feel I am, no matter the realities, right to the issue of whether or not I am a male or a female. Now, I don't want to make harsh of those who are struggling with real issues here, but I have to say to you that the idea that children should be encouraged to believe this rather than to wait and to think through. I can't believe that we would do this to our own children when the evidence is overwhelmingly, not everyone, I know that, but overwhelmingly, the great majority of children as they grow up and go into their late teens and early 20s will resolve these issues quite satisfactorily for themselves. But John, no, we have to, in the name of autonomy, say you are who you feel you are. And any parent knows that a child in their teenage years feels a lot and hasn't yet, particularly, young men, actually, you learned how to use the frontal lobes of the brain properly.
Yeah. John, let me get to Australian politics. Why do you think the Liberals are so unpopular at the moment, and what do you think they need to do to turn things around?
I think there are two things to realise. One is that, I hope this doesn't sound too cheeky, but frankly, the country stood on the shoulders of reforming governments from about 1983 through until 2006 or 7 that put us in a place, strong productivity, strong economic performance, low debt, a good, relatively good tax system now needing major reform again. We've been able to be, if you like, given to the vibe, no hard thinking. Let's just support ourselves in whatever we are, to the point where we're now, of course, borrowing against our children and even the unborn financially. So it's been all very easy. Nobody's had to do any hard thinking. Nobody's had to sit down and long enough and hard enough and say, does 2 and 2 really equal 4? Do we really actually have to pay some attention to productivity, to tax reform, to living within our means? And the second thing I'd say is that these things, there was a time in the mid-90s when it was wall-to-wall Labor. There was a time when John Howard, who became our second longest-serving Prime Minister, faced a bulletin headline that said, Mr. 18% approval ratings, why does this man bother? These things do turn. And again, I don't want to make cheap points, but I will make the point that I see nothing, almost nothing, as somebody who spent a long time in government, in the occupiers of the government benches at the moment, of the skills, the policy understanding and the persuasion capacity needed to front the Australian people for the challenges we've built up for ourselves. That means those challenges will get worse. And I suspect it won't be long before they'll be looking for someone who's actually able to grapple with the real issues.
I want to ask you about some comments by Peter Van Onselen in the Weekend Australian. He said there's large chunks of the community voting against the Liberal Party rather than for Labor because they see the right of politics as increasingly unrepresentative of their values. I would have a different view. I think large chunks of the community are voting against the Liberal Party to punish them because they've gone too far to the left. How do you see that?
Oh, there's absolutely no doubt. Look, in broad terms, the research tells you that about a third of Australians self-identify as left, around 17% as conservative. The 17%, of course, though, are a much greater bulk of the Liberal and the National Party supporters. And many of them have been peeling off somewhere else, sending very strong protest messages. So you've had some people voting for the Teals out of utter frustration because they're sick of the Libs. Perhaps they're on the left end when some of them of the Liberal Party, but they can't bring themselves to vote Labor. But the basis of your party membership, particularly for my party in rural and regional areas, is that 17% who basically still have a conservative worldview and they feel no one represents them anymore. But I'd make this simple point. Look, in the end, can I say to you, the hard facts of life usually tend to be conservative. Mm-hmm. In the end, if you go on living beyond your means the way we are now, there will be a day of reckoning. It's happened historically time and time again. You end up having to reappoint a coalition. Mind you, the coalition's got to get its act together, make it very plain that they really do stand for economic responsibility, not because economics is about a sweet set of numbers, but because it impacts people's lives, the taxes they have to pay, the job opportunities they have, the living standards that they have. And that's just one example. And I think defence is another, where the left, I mean, people ought to go and read, they really should read the Greens' defence policy. And remember how influential the Greens are in the government at the moment. At a time when any thinking person can see how dangerous the world is, they say, no, defund the Australian Defence Forces. We have a better idea. We want an internationally recognised Australian peacekeeping team so that we can negotiate conflicts. Well, I'm sure Mr. Putin would be very relieved to hear this. And, you know, given an opportunity to hear from the politically correct in terms of its composition, because they spell out how to be composed, Australian defence team that the Greens would put together. I'm serious. You can Google it. Just go and look at it. Mr. Putin will then say, oh, thank you so much, Mr. Pratt. I didn't realise I had it all wrong. I'll pull out of the Ukraine now. You know, if there's one thing that is disastrous in politics, it's utopianism as opposed to realism. It always ends up in the ditch, upside down.